A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar in these probably unfortunate circumstances, but unfortunately, uncertainty is a reality. So we use the opportunity to learn and grow together. To this webinar on risk resilience, response to disasters, and expert view. And my, oh my, do we have an expert view here for you today. My name is Dave Cohen, and I will be your host for the next hour. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we are hosting this webinar today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us. In a world where the only thing that is really certain is uncertainty, and understanding how to effectively manage risk, build resilience, and respond to disasters is more critical now than ever. Today, we are thrilled and privileged to bring together a panel of experts who will provide unique insights, actionable strategies, and inspiring stories to help us navigate these challenges. Thank you for joining us today, whether you're here to expand your knowledge, share your expertise, or seek solutions to your own communities or organizational challenges. Please use the Q&A box. Your participation and conversation in this webinar is most valuable. So you're not here to listen to me. Without any further ado, I'd like to just briefly introduce our panel to you. It gives me absolute great pleasure to welcome a global all-star cast in the form of first Tony Pierce. Tony is the emergency management and fire risk consultant. And Tony is a global thought leader in crisis and risk management. Melissa Agnes, who's the founder of the Crisis Ready Institute. Randy Bergman, who's a former fire chief and fire and rescue from Anaheim, California. And the panel will be expertly moderated by our CEO, Dr. Gav Schneider. Their bios will come up. I have done their credentials absolutely no justice, but it's far more valuable for you to hear from them rather than from you to hear from me. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to our moderator for the session, Dr. Gav Schneider. Gav, over to you.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone for joining us. We know your time is incredibly valuable and you have many competing priorities. But we feel it's really important that when bad things do happen, we have to learn from them and we have to learn how to stop future incidents happening in the same way. And that doesn't happen if we don't bring the subject matter experts together to talk about it, share their knowledge, and look at things that we could do differently. Throughout this next hour or so, we'll also be looking at things from a few different angles. And we'd like to be providing you advice on things that you could do as an individual, things that you may think of doing with your team, things that your organization should be thinking about doing, as well as things that overall should impact the efficacy of the way our societies handle disasters, catastrophes, and incidents. We do have an apology from Tony McGurk. Unfortunately, he's down with COVID, which, thank goodness we have many other experts to join us on the panel. A key point, I think, before I hand over to our experts to introduce themselves and share an opening statement, is that an hour is really short and there is so much context, knowledge, and ideas to share that we probably will only scratch the surface. So I would highly recommend that if any of the experts on the panel say something you're really interested in what they had to say, reach out to them. Have side conversations. None of us have all the answers. Otherwise, these bad things wouldn't happen the way they happen, and we'd be way more effective in stopping bad stuff happening and equally learning from it when it does. In no direct order of priority, I'm going to start off by introducing you to Tony Pierce. Tony, please come off mute, introduce yourself, and provide your opening statement when you're ready.
Good on you. Thanks, Gav. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect. Thank you, Tony.
Beautiful. Thank you. Look, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you all are. Nice to be involved, and thank you very much for the invitation, Gav, to have a bit of a chat today as well. Look, I guess I was really quite excited about the opportunity to talk, only because as you said, on the back of events like these, without trying to drill down into the intricacies of what went wrong and why it is what it is, the reality is that there are a whole range of systemic impacts and issues that actually contribute to the sorts of events we're seeing here, but are way above individual actions and so on. And I think any time where you get humans interacting with nature and the environment, then you do find yourself in a place where you are likely to find these sorts of events occurring. So from my perspective, I have a very strong interest in learning from these things and trying to identify ways in which we can try to mitigate potentially the impacts of future events. But to do that, also understanding what it is that actually drives them. Why do we find ourselves in situations where people are being exposed to these sorts of hazards? And then when the hazard eventuates in a way, as we've seen in LA at the moment, Lahaina recently, and then some other places around the world too, why is it that we end up with very similar things occurring event after event, and people asking the same questions about why does this continue to happen? And a lot of that is to do with our emergency management systems and the way in which the system functions and creates that opportunity. So that's the area that I have the interest in. I'm really keen to hear the opinions and pieces from others, and hopefully we'll provide some sort of contribution to you.
Thanks, Tony. And for those of you who weren't familiar with Tony before, please do make sure you check him out, because he is one of the few experts who's actually run emergency response at a national level, state level. He's done investigations into what makes response and prevention work, and has really been a student of how do we make this stuff better for a long time. So Tony, thank you for joining us, and really happy to have you.
Thank you.
Melissa, over to you.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity. As Tony said, I think, Tony, you said it really nicely of why you're not just happy to be here, but why these conversations are important. And so, I mean, I specialize in crisis comms, which to me is very synonymous with crisis leadership. So at the Institute, we train, putting it very simply, next level visionary crisis leaders. And so, Tony, when you opened up by saying posing the question of why do these things continue to happen, my lens, the lens through which I'm always looking at it and kind of give myself a baseline understanding that leads to subsiding my frustration, is the fact that from the crisis comms and crisis leadership standpoint, which is where my expertise sits, is our world, our leaders today haven't been taught adequately how to actually rise and thrive in times of crisis, and thrive in the way of creating connection versus separation and divisiveness. And there's a whole bunch of reasons as to why we haven't been taught those things. I think we can just go to, like, the world hasn't been ready yet to really understand and dissect. We also come from a world of, globally speaking and generally speaking, of this space of emotion is vulnerable, emotion is scary, there's no place for emotion in the boardroom. And yet crises are some of the most emotional times for everybody involved, from the leader, the communicator, the team managing the crisis, to those who are directly impacted by the incidents. And if we don't know how to address the emotion, and it's emotion riddled, it's emotion filled, and then one of the crisis ready rules is you can't beat emotion with logic. We see so many leaders standing up and rising and trying to come at a very highly emotional time with pure logic and facts, and they're missing the mark, as just like one example of why do we continuously see mistakes and failure which lead to pain and suffering in the world. So my area of expertise and what I'm excited to talk to you guys about today, or just share my perspective when it's relevant, is how we can learn to overcome that and do better and rise more effectively and efficiently in times of chaos and suffering and crisis, so that we could create more connection and ultimately lead to a better, safer, less painful world.
Thank you, Melissa. And as always, highly articulate, and we can see why you are one of the world's leading crisis comms experts. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Randy. Randy, you've got a difficult job, because out of our panelists, you're the only one who's actually been a fire chief on the ground in California and has the right understanding of the real on the ground picture compared to what we're looking at. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, just to give you some perspective, approximately 90% of the largest fires in the state of California's history, and the most expensive, have occurred since the year 2000. So if you put that in some context, we can see that our problem is, we're not subsiding our problem, it's actually continuing to get worse. And for me, it really comes back to from a perspective of a fire chief that has responded to and has sent people to these type of large scale devastating incidents. It really comes back to one thing, and that's leadership. And leaders that over the course of the years, and maybe we can get into this, just a little bit of the history of the state of California as we go through the next hour, but for a long time, we know the solutions to minimize the risk for these type of events in California. And it all comes back to the state and elected officials to make the right decisions and to undertake the right actions to actually reduce that level of risk. We're not going to zero it out. We probably never will, but we can do a much better job than we have done. But most of the time it goes back to decisions that have not been made that could have reduced the risk factor statewide and locally. And so that's what I'd kind of like to delve in today, because whether we're looking at individual, organizational, or statewide or national interest of risk, it really comes back to one thing, and that is leaders.
No doubt you are putting your energy and effort into your belief by setting up a foundation designed to educate and grow leadership within the fire and emergency services sector. So thank you for joining us, and really happy to have you. And thank you again for your willingness to share your insights. So to frame the next part of the discussion, we're going to start looking at exploring what could have happened, what can happen, and what could be done differently from our different experts' views, looking at a few different things. A very common emergency and disaster response recovery model is often referred to as the PPRR model, prevent, prepare, respond, and recover. And there are many versions of that. Okay, so we'd like to talk about some of those aspects as it comes together. And equally, many of you who've been following our work have seen that we found it quite effective to talk about risk with three sort of hats on. The compliance hat, what are the things that we all have to do to stop really bad things happening? And they are non-negotiables. And certainly if we take the example of the LA fires, there's no doubt been failures of compliance and methods that should have been in place to prevent things from getting out of control. But compliance itself is not enough. And we've spent a lot of time focusing on the idea of resilience, which is how do we get through this tough stuff and make sure that we come out on the other side. And then ultimately, we'd like to focus a little bit more on the presilience side. What could we do in the future to not let this happen again or minimize the consequences? And equally, how do we turn these things into learnings and opportunities? I do really appreciate Randy's comment about the fact that things like fire risk are probably never going to be zeroed as long as we're using electricity and using fire itself. Much the same as things like violence or terrorism are probably not going to disappear as long as we have disagreements and people feel violence is a tool that they will use to get their point across. So we've got a lot of work to do. As we have this discussion, I'd urge you as a listener and attendee to be thinking about what we talk about from what's often referred to as an all hazards view. So we're not thinking only one risk, but clearly with the devastation and severe damage and impact that's happened in California, it's a really good example for us to leverage. So to start off with, I'd like to ask the panelists for their view on where some of the failures happened that let this become such a big problem. And that's probably a Randy starting point, noting your expertise on the ground. And then Tony, if you, from an independent view, want to jump in afterwards and talk maybe about what you've seen systemically. And Melissa, if you've got any thoughts on the messaging and the comms, we can kind of follow that sequence. So Randy, over to you first.
Well, let's step back and go back to the Bel Air fire in 1961. And that was really the first fire that was an urban interface fire in a high value district, and significant loss. But it also pointed out several things that the state undertook, as well as the fire service, and that was an integrated communication system, because we didn't have one at that time. The master mutual aid system, that is probably one of the best in the world, was born out of that fire because we couldn't access resources collectively and efficiently. But, also I think it pointed out to the fact, and we've seen this in the last 30 or 40 years, we learned from that experience in the thousands of fires that have occurred that there are several things that we can do from an integrated risk management perspective, community risk reduction perspective, that if we would just have undertaken over a period of time, we would have reduced the risk substantially in the state of California for wildfire. And some of those have been talked about for 35, 40 years. And in fact, my late mentor, Ron Coleman, who passed away about a year and a half ago, reminded me of a conversation that he had 35 years ago in the governor's office with the state forestry department, with a group of chiefs. And they, at the time, said, we need to do some very basic things. One is we need to bury our power lines throughout our forest and in our communities. We need to develop a comprehensive fire management plan for our forest, because we don't have that now. Interesting statistic, there are over 36 million dead trees in the state of California, over 1.5 million acres that exist today. And the reason why many of those trees are still there is because the environmentalists don't want them have them removed. So there's a significant, dry, dead fire problem that's just waiting to burn. So, if we manage our forest better, we bury our power lines, we minimize the building in our urban interface areas, we reduce our risk, and we invest in those things over a period of time, we will eventually lower the risk factor, not only in our forest, but that same strategy should be taken through, as we've seen in Palisades and some of the other cities. That has to go throughout the system, because we have built hills along hillsides throughout Southern California. So I think there are some things that we can tackle and do. But again, it gets back to elected leadership actually having the wherewithal and the courage to take those steps to do that and set a plan in place to do it over a period of time.
And it seems to me like you've pretty much provided a playbook of resilience in terms of fire prevention there. But it's fascinating to me, and as most of you who are listening and followed my work know, in the last book I spoke a lot about ignorance, negligence, and denial, and the challenge we've got to overcome those three variables. And often it's not the subject matter knowledge nor the resources, it's the perception of the risks we face that lead to these negative outcomes. And one of the harshest challenges we've got is to change our mindsets away from, wow, we've had terrible fires, how do we make sure they don't happen again, to learn from the point that Randy just made, that if the Bel Air fire was a turning point in California, this is a mindset and decision-making failure, probably more than it is anything else. Really, really interesting. Tony, would you like to come on and share a little bit about what you think from what you've seen in terms of things that might have led to this happening the way it did, and what we might be able to do to prevent such things in future?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gav, and thanks, Randy. That was, I would say, tick, tick, tick. I'd agree with 100% with everything you said. Not from a practitioner perspective, but certainly from an inquirer perspective. Actually, looking into these events after the event, and what you've said pretty much encapsulates most of the big picture reasons as to why we seem to end up in the similar sorts of positions we are. If I look at the front end part of it, we have a situation where governments, and I say this plurally because this is a global issue that I've certainly seen it globally, is that governments, I don't think for 1 minute intend for things to happen and deliberately lead badly. And certainly at the end of all of my inquiries, I think government has always accepted every recommendation. So that's fine. They accept the recommendations. The problem that we have is that all of the lessons that we've identified through there, the intention of that is that they become lessons learned by then implementing policies and funding and resourcing and so on to actually mitigate that lesson, to make sure that becomes a lesson learned. And in the initial stage, governments are absolutely 100% on board. They contribute a lot of money initially. They agree to they design policies, etc. But what they don't do is look far enough ahead to ensure that a lot of the things that they put in place are actually sustainable, or that going through political cycles and recognising that political challenges will occur along the way, that they have some sort of fallback to ensure that they can continue to maintain the implementation of the things that need to be put in place. So I think initially, generally, after nearly every inquiry, the government's intent is pure. They respond appropriately. They initially resource things to allow organisations to get on with doing the things that have to be done. But then in the longer term, it starts to fall away. And that happens for a whole raft of reasons. As I said, and policy initiatives change, budgetary constraints come in. And unfortunately, the entity that ends up holding the baby is normally the organisation responsible on the ground who is face to face with the community, and they become the bad guy in that, which is really quite sad. The other thing I think that's important is that, you know, we've got to get through a situation of allowing people to put themselves in places of risk. And that goes back to that urban planning issue. It goes back to the interface issue. And surely some people are in those environments and they can't move away from their standing is such that they have to stay where they are. But governments across the world allow people to continue to move into those areas. And when those people move in, they have no understanding of the risk environment in which they're moving into, which then actually exacerbates the risk for those who actually live there long term and do understand it, because they are also now trying to compensate for a whole population that's come in that has no understanding at all of that environment. So just some thoughts there, Gav.
Thank you, Tony, and certainly some really good food for thought. And thank you for taking such a high-level view, because realistically, I think one of the failures that humans often fall into, or a trap we often fall into, is let's blame the most convenient, most visible source, where practically when something catastrophic like this happens, it's that old Swiss cheese model. There's normally lots and lots of little things that have gone wrong along the way. Just before I hand over to Melissa, please, for our attendees, we do have a Q&A box where you can type your questions, and we're very happy to get to your questions, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. So from now on, feel free to start populating questions into the Q&A box, and we will get to them as we can through this time. Melissa, really a tough kind of piece to unpack, because everything is still unfolding. And we see part of the challenge in the modern world that we're in now is this misinformation, disinformation, lack of trust in the way we communicate with each other, causing significant challenges in the way people respond, perceive threat, and action effectively. What are your thoughts around looking at the way the kind of crisis comms piece unfolded and how we could look at that piece as a learning opportunity?
Can I actually start by, if you don't, and tell me if you don't want me to, but I'd love to ask the audience, for those who were, whether you're present in LA or surrounding areas, or were watching it from anywhere else in the world, what was your response, your perception, your feelings around the response that you were seeing? If you can put it in the Q&A chat, just like one word that you felt over the last week as you watch it, because I think that that's so relevant, right? I can talk here about what was done wrong, and we can go into that. I can talk about what can be done better in the future. But I think when we start hearing from people on how they felt when they were watching, when they were horrified, when they were sad, when they were grief-stricken, it gives a lot of insight. Guys, don't be shy. There's no wrong answer. It's so important. You mentioned blaming. And blaming is a self-protective mechanism, right, of the identity, of the ego, of the self, to self-preserve. And so when we talk about standing up as a leader when people's lives are being destroyed right in front of your eyes as you're speaking in real time, there's a lot of fear and emotion that goes into that, to having that. Or to have to then that leads to a response or a reaction. It's not even a response, a reaction like blame or othering, which creates more division. So one of the ways, and one of the things, a lot of things went so wrong in this case, but for example, like lack of information, right? There's literally pictures or videos of the mayor of LA just standing in front of the cameras, just not saying anything. And we know today, we need to know that no comment is one of the biggest comments of I don't care. I'm not in it with you or for you. So there was that. There was misinformation and miscoordinated information between different governing parties. Multiple voices just not being in sync, which creates confusion. And when people don't know who to trust and who to turn to, well, then there's a void that's left there for any other self-serving agenda, like party who has a self-serving agenda, to pick up into that void and to start riffing on it, to start taking the lead from there. There were defensive reactions, which again, self-preservation versus coming together as a community, which really needs to be, connection needs to be the goal in crisis comms and crisis leadership. There was the fact that people were underprepared and overwhelmed. So there's like that amplified emotion, but then that led to a lot of the blame that you're talking about as well. And there was a lot of emotional detachment in the communications that were especially initially put out, which means that when you're in a crisis, in a catastrophe, where people are feeling heightened emotion, and a strong leader in crisis comms and just leadership in general when they're speaking has the strength and has the courage to stand in my household, we call it getting in the ditch with people, versus standing above the ditch and being like, here's a lifeline, but I'm too scared to be down there with you when I'm supposed to be the leader and you're supposed to, like, essentially you're supposed to be following me. So there was a lot of lack of courage in getting into the thick of the emotions and addressing, naming the emotions, naming the fear, so that people could feel safe and feel reassured that they were, one of the crisis ready formulas when you're responding to a crisis is first to validate emotion. In order to validate emotion, you have to name the emotion. People need to feel seen and heard in how they're feeling. Then you relate to what matters. So safety, well-being, preserving home and life and planet. And then you can come with the proof. And when you're coming in with the proof, the part of the formula is you need to reassure, you need to provide hope, and then you need to continuously have the courage to step into the mess of the emotion, the mess of the energy with people to create unity. And there was just, all of that was lacking.
Thanks, Melissa. And as you were talking, thank you, attendees, for jumping in and populating some of what Melissa asked. There's words like scary, people over property, misguided. Graham Kennedy, you can see you've been doing this for a while. Not surprising, to be honest. Ann Davis commented chaos, uninformed. So it's interesting to kind of see the different views there. Melissa, do you want to just comment on that quickly, and then we'll move back to the next panelist?
No, I'm grateful for people sharing, and we could always go into them more deeply if the conversation goes there.
Awesome, thank you. Just conscious of time, that we would also like to get to audience questions. So thank you, panelists, just for sharing some views there. I'd like to go back to Randy, just with a view of what the actual on-the-ground responders have faced in terms of challenges. And, you mentioned mutual aid. There's often this perception, particularly for people outside of the US, that, everybody works together, there's plenty of resources, and everybody's there to back each other up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Looking at how long the fires have burned for and how complicated these challenges have been, do you want to maybe just share a bit of insight around what it must be like on the ground? Not from a reporter perspective, but from a practitioner and responder perspective.
Yeah, I'd love to. First of all, I think people need to understand, and this is when I knew that the significance of this fire. Throughout California, but especially in Southern California, they have the most resourced agencies. They're the best trained. They have the most experience responding to major emergencies, but especially wildland fires like this. Probably they're the best in the world. And so when we saw that initial hour and a half, 2 hours, where they were literally getting overrun, and they probably already had a couple, 2,000 to 3,000 firefighters there or en route. That kind of told me the significance and the breadth of this fire. So, our hats off to our first responders. What it's like on the ground, it's like hell, literally. When the wind's blowing 70, 80, 90 miles an hour, and they had gusts of 100 miles an hour coming down the hillsides and toward the ocean. Your fire's blowing sideways past you, and there's little that you can do. It's spotting fires, half mile, 3/4 of a mile downwind. And so it's skipping it's flying right over your head, 1,000 feet in the air. And so it's just absolutely, you cannot contain it. And so with all those resources, you just have to, the fire dictates what you do and where you set up and how you have to move your resources. And so again, that's where
Thanks very much, Randy. And I think that's a really good segue point around the risk management failures. You know, we often don't look back and go, hold on, this is something we knew. We had scoped the risk. We had understood the risk. We had even designed the treatments for the risk. The failure was in the implementation or the adaptation of the way we treated these risks. And it raises a very challenging point, because I think one of the earlier statements you made was, you know, the challenge of environmentalists versus fire prevention experts. And it's really a risk discussion, right? And only once we see something as catastrophic as this happen, everyone in hindsight goes, oh, we should have done that. But part of our challenge comes back to our ability to communicate those things in a way, almost like Melissa was highlighting, that the more we can come together as a community, the easier it is to deal with these disruptions that will happen at a disruption level before they become disasters and catastrophes. So I'm going to segue. Thank you. There's questions coming in already. And this is a good one for Tony. And it kind of links to what we're talking about. So we'll take the question now. Tony, how do you think the public service can influence governments to ensure the longevity of decisions, which goes beyond their term, and the long-term understanding of what is required in all parts of emergency planning, response, relief, and recovery? I bet, Tony, you're glad not to be working for government directly when you get asked a question like that, because at least you can share your view now. Over to you to answer that one.
Yeah, thanks, Gav, and thank you to whoever that was that asked the question. Look, I think we all know, you know, I did an opinion piece on LinkedIn the other day asking about why it is that, you know, senior emergency managers and chiefs, etc., very often, once they're out of their roles and into retirement or whatever, all of a sudden have a voice, and they now have an opinion, and they have views on how to resolve things. And it's very complicated. Obviously, when you're in those positions, and I'm sure Randy would appreciate this, you know, there is a degree to which you can be open and frank and fearless with your political masters and tell them what has to be done. And there's also a way to do that. But I think for me, it's always been a case of, from an inquiry perspective at least, is conducting inquiries in a way that gets away from the fault finding and gets into the fact finding, and tries to produce evidence to governments to go back and say, you know, in the bigger picture, even if it's only within the 4-year cycle of your elections that you worry about at the moment, the potential for this to happen again is significant. Even within that 4-year period, it is significant. It can happen any year. As a result of that, there are significant benefits to you investing, and there are significant benefits to you then following through with making sure that your investment is actually implemented. Because ultimately, communities are losing, there is a rising level of distrust and mistrust and confidence in government being able to protect communities. Now, when I say protect, I don't mean that government is solely responsible for that. This is a shared responsibility. Community has a significant part to play in doing this as well. But for the bits that government has control of and can influence, then they have to be able to see in front of them why it is valuable for them to be able to do what it is that has to be done. If we just simply emotionally run around saying, but you've got to do it, people are going to die, etc., that does not provide an evidence base that is going to be enough to convince a government to do things that are really, really significant when they are also facing policy decisions across a whole raft of different things that impact communities. So again, I think ultimately it comes down to, we have to be able to identify and express solutions to governments that they actually understand and can see the benefit to them as well as communities in actually implementing.
Thanks, Tony. That was a very detailed and accurate description of something that's incredibly hard to do in practice. But part of the challenge, I think, also is we've got these competing priorities, and this often becomes an issue of risk prioritization, which is a human problem, right? Because many risks, even though we've done so much work in the risk sector at looking at how we could potentially integrate risk or look at an enterprise type risk approach so we can score and prioritize where we want to put our limited resources. But more and more, those things are driven by perception of the human who holds the budget, or in many cases, short-term political agendas, which makes it really tough. So switching angles a little bit, I might answer this question for Melissa because I think it's an awkward question, but Matthew Vaughan asked, hey, Melissa, what is the best course or learnings to improve crisis comms? I'll share. I think Melissa's course is probably the best one out there for crisis comms, simply because there aren't that many experts that are focusing on that area as an area of specialization. So if you want to check out Melissa's stuff, I reckon it is among the best out there. But Melissa, if we can switch angles a little bit and potentially look at, if we look at crisis comms, we know there's layers, right? There's the voice in my own head. There's what I'm telling others. There's what others are telling me. There's what organizations are telling people. There's what councils or counties are telling people. There's what the state's telling people. There's what federal structures are telling people. Any advice on how to align some of those pieces to get a decent outcome and recover from some of this trauma a little quicker?
Alignment prior to, are you guys getting backlash or backfeed? Backfeed,
Okay.
You're good. Alignment prior to. So Crisis Ready Institute, we're all about being crisis ready. Crisis ready is more than just having a plan. A plan will do very little to actually serve you in the heat of the moment when you've created a plan as a line item on your to-do list and then filed it away. So we really, similarly to resilience, we take the cultural approach to it. And so in those three components, those three like foundational kind of categories or pillars of being crisis ready is having the right mindset permeate throughout the organization from leadership down. And the right mindset shapes everything. So the way that we choose to perceive a challenge will directly impact the actions that we take, which directly impacts the results. So mindset is everything. Skill set, so more than just having a plan with, check boxes or, do this if this that nobody knows about. It's how can you equip your entire team to understand what risks looks like, so they can say, oh, this is a yellow flag or this is a red flag and I know what to do with it. And then especially in the comm space, because things unfold so quickly, having this mindset of we're going to control the narrative is already a losing battle, because we cannot control any narratives today, period. What we can do is strive to own your piece of the narrative. And in doing that, more over to kind of bring in your question, Gav, is making sure that you're aligned with the other parties, the other partners that you need to be in alignment with in crisis in order to serve the common good, the greater good, which are the people that you're designed to serve in the first place. So skill set. And then after that is the third pillar is the capability. So that's your governance structure, that's your processes, that's your protocols, that's your program and the evolution of the program over time. But having the mindset and the skill set and having alignment and making sure that the parties that you're going to need to work with in order to save lives, property, and environment, and making sure that they have the right mindset and they have the right skill set and that your capabilities are aligned, that is something that everybody should be doing right now prior to any risk occurring.
Thanks, Melissa. And this gives us a really good segue. Anonymous asked a question: why have communities, individuals, lost self-resilience? Seem to expect government to fix everything. So it's an interesting piece that can open up a discussion for us now around sort of community engagement, community resilience, community preparation, and individual preparation. And Melissa, you made a very powerful statement there, which I think is really important, around the fact that we can own our own response, our own recovery, our own mindset piece. And if we don't do that, it's incredibly difficult to recover quickly, because you're stuck sort of in the cycle of victimhood as opposed to learning and improving. So let's open up. Whoever wants to respond to this one first, in terms of why do we feel that communities or individuals have lost self-resilience? Tony, you're in first. Let's go.
Yeah, thanks, Gav. Great. I don't know who that is, but great question. And I'm not sure where they're from. So that's obviously going to taints maybe a little bit the way they respond to what I'm about to say. If I take Victoria as an example, I think it's almost the obverse of that. Things have changed somewhat, particularly in areas. If I go back to the comment I made before about people who traditionally live in these high-risk areas, so therefore have grown up with what it is that's happening around them and understand it. When I've inquired into fires in areas like that, what the community have said to me is that what they actually want from government is information. Government is the holder of the information that allows them to make the decisions that they need to make to look after themselves. They don't want governments having to rock in every time something happens. They don't expect the fire truck up the driveway. We've heard that a lot about, oh, you're not going to get it, you're not going to get it. Surprisingly, a lot of communities actually don't expect the fire truck to come up to their gate every single time, particularly those who've been in the environment for a long period. But what they want is information that government holds that allows them then to make the decisions that they need to make to be more resilient and to be able to look after themselves. And I think where we fail, again, I'll say this in a generic sense, governments generally fail to communicate between events with communities on an ongoing basis to allow them to maintain relationships and to maintain an understanding of the risk environment that they're in. All of a sudden something happens, government's there, stuff happens, it all goes wrong, people say, oh, it was their fault, but there's no to little engagement between the events actually occurring that's ongoing that allows everyone to actually understand and have their expectations managed. So I actually don't think there, at least in the environment that I've been in recent years investigating, I don't think that there is a broad expectation that government will fix everything and that resilience has decreased. But I think there is an expectation or a failure of communication, if you like, in Melissa's world, between government and the community to understand what does it mean and what do you need from us to allow you to make the decisions that you need to make.
Thanks, Tony. Randy, do you want to comment on that, or Melissa?
I'll comment.
Thanks,
or I'll
Melissa.
contribute. I'll contribute. So yes, absolutely. Building up in law enforcement, they like to say building up the bank of community trust. So spending time earning trust prior to crisis is the best way to be trusted in crisis, so long as you consistently earn that trust through crisis. The other piece, though, looking at this question of why have communities or individuals lost self-resilience and seem to expect government, my mind goes to also just the way of society. We live up until 2020 when pandemic hit, our generation and the generation before us, we haven't had, especially in where we live in North America, I'll just speak for North America, but we didn't grow up with war or with all of these different in our countries. Everything was easy. Everything has been made easy. You go onto Amazon, you order a book, it's there the next day. You order your groceries online and they're at your door within an hour. So everything has been easy and not necessarily self-sufficient. So I think that there's also just I don't want to use the word lazy because it's been this trained programming of the way of technology in our society where people today haven't needed to be resilient more than maybe just within their own families or their own emotions or going to therapy or whatever their own obstacles are. But we've lived in a very privileged, I think that's the word, we've lived in a very privileged society, a lot of us, where we haven't been faced with needing to learn how to self-protect or self-defend or live in survival mode because we get to be in creation mode. Does that make sense? So I think that that's just a contributor, and that one is no one's fault. That's the benefits of technology and the great world that we live in, as well as the risk of the same.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Randy, any thoughts from your side? I know you've done a lot of work also in sort of community engagement and building community resilience.
Yeah, I think at least in the state of California, I think that I think most people that live in the state of California are really focused on at least having 3 to 4 days of personal resilience in case of an emergency. And it's not only because of wildfire. I mean, there's the chance of earthquakes and tsunamis, and so you have a lot of potential. And I think the general population takes that very, very seriously. And I think that starts at the local level, and that's if there's a focus at the local level to drive that home to their residents and support that effort, I think it goes a long way. That's probably not a statewide issue more than it's a local issue. And that starts with the leadership of your public safety department, but also the leadership of your elected officials stating that that's important. And the expectation is in throughout the state of California, you're on your own for 3 days. That's how long it's going to take potentially if we have a major earthquake. So you have to be responsible for yourself for 3 days. That establishes a level of accountability for the resident and a level of accountability for the government response.
Thanks, Randy. And, that's a fascinating insight, because if you look at the fact that you shared there, which is the idea that residents are expected to be prepared for 3 to 4 days, that almost highlights the challenge of acceptance being the problem, not necessarily process, policy, guidance, etc., which makes it really tough for us. Next point there was Asaf Ahmed asked made a point. Is there a plan to include resilience as a norm when planning and zoning areas for community, be it for residential or commercials or environmental planning? So I'd kind of like to answer that one first, because I think there's a good example. And for those of you who haven't seen, if you look at the Getty Villa or the Getty Museum in LA, they applied resilience. They built a structure that was fire resistant. So I don't think this is one of those things that we have to wait for governments and for authorities to tell us we should start implementing proactive methodologies early. In fact, it's incumbent on us to be thinking about what are the primary major risks that keep affecting humans and creating negative outcomes. And we've got thousands of years of records on this, whether it's fire, war, disease. We know these things tend to be challenging. The harder part now, and I would probably segue to Melissa's point there, around people don't like to take personal responsibility because it involves effort and energy expenditure. But this is where it starts. If the individual owns what's going to happen to them and their family, and all the families do that, you then have a more resilient and secure community. If all the communities do that, you have safer areas and counties, which means the authorities can do what they have to do with support and efficacy. So we know what to do. The challenge is, how do we make sure we commit the right resourcing and effort, because we can't manage every risk. So it becomes a discussion on critical risk management. So what I'd like to do now, just conscious of time, is I'd like to ask each panelist to take roughly a minute or two and share any key thoughts they've got on how we could make sure we better plan, prevent, respond, recover, apply methodologies that minimize damage or prevent bad things from happening, full stop. And you can do that at the individual, team, organization, or societal level. The floor is yours to share whatever your key takeaways you'd like the audience to have. Let's start with Tony, and then we'll go Randy, and then Melissa.
Yeah, thanks, Gav. I think at the individual level, maybe if I start there again, I think one of the problems that we do have is that not so much in the regional areas or the wildland areas, but certainly on that urban interface area, is that our communities are really now they're quite nomadic, if you like. Therefore, the fact that people have to move around so much for employment and for being able to afford accommodation, et cetera, means that they are probably less attuned to the environment that they're in. And I go back to that comment before I made about, individuals not really understanding their risk. So the relationship then between them and government is really important, because government recognising that has to be able to provide information for them to be able to make the sorts of decisions they need to make. So that's one thing, I guess, it's important. From a team perspective, I think as far as organisations, if I think of team and think about organisations that are responding to these events, they're in a bit of a juxtaposition in day to day, they're just fighting, trying to respond to the events that are occurring around them. But at the same time, having to try and find and make the space to be able to sit down to make the arguments to take forward to get the better resources, to get better urban planning provisions in place, to get better infrastructure in place to be able to help withstand the impacts of events. So that's really an area of significant difficulty for many organisations to be able to do. And then at the higher levels, again, as I said, there's conducting inquiries and getting the answers to be able to help identify what the future could look like if you were to do it properly are really important. But then putting monitoring processes in place and having an expectation that if a recommendation is accepted, that it actually will be acquitted and it will be implemented is really important. Otherwise, You simply go back to the start again and you conduct another inquiry and you pay people like me lots of money to do it, and then you ignore it or you don't implement it, and round it goes. So it's a cyclic thing, Gav, and the cycle has to be completed. You can't break it.
Thanks, Tony. And, it is one of those things I can't but help smile in frustration, as I'm sure many of you do, because if I wasn't smiling, I'd probably be crying around the lessons we don't learn. And the fact that we have so many examples of what to do to stop these catastrophic things happening, but we get distracted as humans, and it makes it really tough. So one of the points I think you made there, which is really, really important, is the follow through, and to actually make sure we have slightly longer term thinking in the way we look to tackle these risks. And, as the climate and energy issues come to the fore, it's really interesting to see that, climate risk is such a long-term piece we're trying to manage, and we're trying to manage it short-term. But in reality, it doesn't help, using Randy's earlier example, that we save the forest, but everything gets burnt down later because of poor planning. So there's got to be a lot more crossover in the way we tackle risk. And there's got to be a lot more understanding of the fact that we are no longer looking at siloed risk, but we're looking at intersecting systemic risks, which lead to these polycrises and multiple events happening simultaneously. Thank you. Randy, over to you.
Well, for me, it comes back to identified accountability and leadership. And I think that we need to really articulate what everybody's responsible for. And back to Melissa's comment, there's a responsibility individually. There's a responsibility for us if we lead an organization, and there's a responsibility if you're an elected official to be accountable for the areas that you're responsible for. And we just can't rely on one or two departments in a city or a state to be reliant 100% on in these emergencies. Everybody's got to have a level of accountability, and that needs to be identified, and the expectations need to be set out. The other thing I think it gets back to is just real leadership and the courage to just do the right thing. I mean, we're talking about the same things that we've talked about for 40 years. And we need to demand competent leaders, and we need to elect competent leaders that will do the right thing, make the right decisions even when it's hard to do, and put their people first and the politics second. And that's what really needs to happen. And California is facing, I think, some significant discussion after this last event, and you're already starting to see there's a shift. There's a shift in the dialogue, and that needs to happen because this can't happen again. And it starts with just being competent leaders and just doing the right thing.
Thanks, Randy. And, to your point, if it was so easy to find, create, and have great leaders, we would see a better outcome. But, I think your point is so powerful that realistically, if this is a leadership vacuum, I would urge our attendees to be thinking of leadership at a personal level too. If I can't make myself do stuff, if I can't protect my family, if I can't look after my colleagues in the workplace, we have challenges. So to your point, this is not just a political leadership challenge, it's the ability for us to actually be able to respond and prevent things due to good decision making. So thank you, Randy. And even as I'm listening to you, it must be incredibly hard for somebody like you to sit and watch what's happening, knowing that you've put so much work into trying to stop these things from happening in the first place. Melissa, over to you for a closing statement.
There's so much I could say, but Randy, I love that you said accountability and courage. Leadership comms. You cannot successfully manage a crisis if you don't know how to effectively communicate your ownership of the message of that crisis towards safety, towards connection, towards all of these, the greater good, right? Doing what's right, as you said. And there's so much, if I'm going to leave something, there's so much that our society has not been taught that lends to that skill that it's nobody's fault, it's just the way that it is, but it is time for that to change. And so for those who are listening, and if you're intrigued on that, like this skill that I'm talking about transforms not just your life personally, because everything is about relationships, everything is about people, and communication is at the heart of those relationships and that connectivity. But it is also when you learn how to be a leader, and that is anybody and everybody, right? You don't have to be an elected official, you don't have to be the CEO of an organization. No matter who you are, where you're sitting, at what table you sit, you are a leader. And you have the opportunity, especially because there's such a lack of this knowledge and this courage that's required. There's such an opportunity right now amidst all of the chaos and all of the shifts that we are going to continue to face moving forward, for humans, for leaders to start to fill in the gaps of what, even just asking the question of what are the skills in terms of comms and courage and emotional relatability and all these things that I don't know, because there's tons that we all don't know because we haven't been taught. And yet the more you know about that, the more you will find the courage, you will like empower yourself with the courage to actually rise and shine in those moments of crisis, and can be that catalyst for unity that we really, 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 truly need.
Thanks, Melissa. There's so many key points that came out of these three closing statements. It's not even possible to summarize those in a way that will do it justice. But a couple of key points before I hand over to Dave to close. Firstly, we all have an responsibility and an accountability to look after the world we live in, the cities we live in, our families, ourselves, and our colleagues. And there are so many ways to help and so many ways we can do things. But from our side, when we put on these little webinars and we grab industry experts from around the world, it is to share knowledge. So my first request is, if you took the time to listen to this webinar and you found value, share it as widely as you want. We will publish it post this, and it will be available online. But equally, give us feedback on things you want to hear. If you'd like to know more about a certain aspect, or you'd like to understand a little bit more how to do something, we feel it's our responsibility collectively to be sharing knowledge. Okay? Otherwise, people can't make the right decisions. So if you are stuck, feel free to reach out to any of the panelists, to myself, to our colleagues. We are not going to be able to solve these problems alone. And the more we pull together, the more likely we are to, at the very least, enable these things to be not catastrophic and not turn into disasters. I think the reality of what Randy said is quite important. We will not eliminate fire risk in totality, just like we're highly unlikely to eliminate violent behavior, at least in my lifetime. I mean, it would be wonderful to live in a world where those things didn't exist. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't improve after each event and minimize the likelihood of these things happening and the impact when they do happen. So from my side, a very big thank you to all our panelists and to all of you who tuned in, and I'll hand over to Dave to close.
Thanks, Gav. And just on that point, I think I've identified about another 5 webinars that we could probably extrapolate from this one alone. So thank you. And thank you to you all for joining us today for this insightful discussion on risk resilience and how we respond to disasters. It certainly was an expert view. I hope that you found the conversation as valuable and as thought-provoking as I did. The expertise shared by our panelists highlights the importance of really proactive planning, adaptive strategies, and collaboration is key in navigating the complexities of disaster and response in resilience. I put the challenge to each one of you to carry forward the key lessons and the insights from today as we continue to build a safer, more resilient community and organizations. On behalf of everyone today involved in the webinar, I extend my gratitude to you all, to Gav for expertly moderating the panel, to Melissa, to Tony, to Randy. Your insights were absolutely invaluable, and thank you for joining us from all around the world. And to the team behind the scenes to make this all possible. Things like this don't just happen. A lot of work goes on behind the scenes to put this production together. And if you have any further questions or would like to explore on echoing Gav's sentiments, please reach out to any of us or the panelists specifically directly through their LinkedIn, and I'm sure they would love to carry on the conversation with you further. Just to cap off the webinar, we, as Risk to Solution, the hosts of the webinar, would like to extend to you an offer to our graduate certificate program, which will be running starting in the first week of February. Graduate Certificate in Organizational Resilience, Risk and High Reliability. The registrations for that cohort are closing on the 31st of July, and the course starts on the 7th of February. So if you'd like more information, costs associated with that, please reach out to me and I will be glad to provide them to you. And then as a complimentary offer to each one of you for attending, please, we are extending an offer to all of you to partake in our 2 courses on our academy, our GSAT Express, General Safety, Security and Awareness training, as well as our Stressful Situation Response Management. 2 short courses which are really valuable and powerful programs to be able to provide that extra layer of knowledge, resilience and resilience in your approach to responding to crises going forward. So for that information, you'll see all the information on how to get in contact with us on the screen. Please feel free to take advantage of those. We'd love to for you to take that up. And finally, we're out of time. A big thank you to you again, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future and future sessions and future webinars that we host. Have a wonderful morning, evening, or afternoon. Stay safe and be resilient.